Hello, Kreuzer überhaupt, and thank you for joining me on this virtual tour of the School of Art Museum and Galleries collections at Aberystwyth University. My name is Harry Heuser. I'm Senior Lecturer in Art History, Director of Research and Equality Champion at the school. Now, selecting just 6 representative examples from our collections of about 25,000 objects of visual and material culture has been a challenge. First of all, what does that mean, representative? Our collections have grown and changed over the years, which means that some objects represent our past, others are present. But all of the objects I have chosen for this talk encourage us to face the future of institutions such as ours. They remind us to engage meaningfully and responsibly with our past, address the concerns of the present, and propose a vision going forward. There has been a museum at Aberystwyth University pretty much since the university's founding in 1872. Now, in those early years, access to the collections was limited, as was the case in most museums. Curating back then meant to care for objects, not to care about making those objects accessible. And that is very much what we are doing here in this building today. What you're looking at, the Grade 2-star listed Edward Davis building, is not a purpose-built museum. It was designed by Alfred William Stevens Cross, Vice President of the Royal Institute of British Architects, and was opened in 1907 as the university's chemistry laboratories. The university's art department moved here more than 85 years later in 1993. To this date, the School of Art is a place where art is made, debated, and displayed. Our holdings are very much a teaching collection. The teaching of art at Aberystwyth University was established in 1917 with the support of Gwendolyn and Margaret Davies of Llandinam in Montgomeryshire. The Davies sisters were philanthropists and pioneer collectors of Impressionist and post-Impressionist paintings, which they would bequeath to the National Museum of Wales in Cardiff. To what was then the art department of the University College of Wales, Aberystwyth, the sisters gifted £5,000 in order to develop a teaching collection of original artworks intended, in the words of our former curators, to instruct and inspire. And even though our museum and school did not start out in this magnificent building overlooking the town of Aberystwyth and Cardigan Bay beyond, it is serendipitous that we ended up here because the building too had been a gift from the Davies sisters in memory of their father, Edward Davies, after whom it is named. Our university museum was not always an art museum. In fact, its first curator was a professor of chemistry. But what he said in 1882 is still relevant today. The old coin, he argued, or indeed any object of visual and material culture may, in his words, teach more of real vivid history than an ordinary student can learn from many pages of a book. Now, as an educator, I cringe a little at that line, as I do at Wordsworth's "one impulse from a vernal wood" that supposedly may teach us more about ourselves than all the sages could. Nonetheless, it is a reminder of our mission to instruct and inspire through the works in our collections. In keeping with that mission, the objects featured in this talk were chosen based on the criteria of relevance and resonance. Relevance to our collections, as well as resonance to us, for us today. Okay, relevance to our collections. Let's start with this painting, Rebecca Solomon's Wounded Dove. It entered our collections in 1882, when our institution still operated as a general museum, rather than a museum devoted to arts and crafts. There are 2 dates here in the caption. One refers to a painting of that title, perhaps this very same work being exhibited in 1866. The other denotes the year when the Victorian dilettante George Powell acquired the work for his eclectic collection of fine and decorative art, coins and curiosities, books and manuscripts, some authentic, some not so much. Today, the George Powell bequest constitutes only a very small part of our collections, but it includes many of the collection's highlights and popular favorites, such as this painting. It casts a gentle and demure woman in a domestic setting that is in keeping with what the Victorian poet Coventry Patmore termed the angel in the house. The view that this domestic interior seems to promote is that a woman's sphere is in the home. She is carer and comforter, a role rendered here as a visual metaphor by the wounded bird in a young woman's hands. Except in this case, the painter is also a woman, a Jewish woman, and a social reformer and activist at that. In 1859, Rebecca Solomon had joined a group of women artists who successfully petitioned the Royal Academy of Arts in London to open its schools to women. Solomon herself exhibited regularly at the Royal Academy. Rebecca Solomon was the older sister of the painter Simeon Solomon. The siblings had a close relationship. They lived together and worked in the same studio. Some of Simeon Solomon's works, dating from about the same period as The Wounded Dove, are also in the School of Art collection: Roman Youth and Love Dreaming by the Sea. Simeon Solomon's subjects are ambiguous, androgynous, and strangely suggestive, whereas Rebecca Solomon's Wounded Dove seems uncomplicated, pleasing, and reassuringly easy to read. But whether Rebecca Solomon's painting might have a subtext is a matter of context. Simeon and Rebecca Solomon's works were exhibited alongside of each other in our galleries in the student-curated show Queer Tastes in 2015. The show was devoted to the collector, George Powell, his passions, his identity, and his persona. If remembered at all, Powell is now chiefly remembered as a friend of, and some have argued, bad influence on the poet Algernon Swinburne, with whom he gallivanted around our town and spent time in Normandy in a cottage named after a bisexual character in a work of fiction by the Marquis de Sade. The Powell family estate of Nanterres was situated just a few miles inland from Aberystwyth, but as a young man, George Powell did not spend much time there. He was at one point forbidden to enter his father's house. Instead of hunting and shooting, as his father would have preferred, young Powell wrote poetry and eventually, as a college dropout, reinvented himself as a man of the world, a collector, and a benefactor to the town of Aberystwyth. Now, the town was, in Powell's words, too benighted to appreciate the proposed gift of his collection, so he bequeathed, as he put it, all that he possessed of bigotry and virtue, meaning trinkets and treasures alike, to our worthy institution. Included in the bequest were over 150 paintings, prints, and drawings, among them watercolors by Turner and Richard Westall, as well as works by the Pre-Raphaelites and their circle, Rossetti, Burne-Jones, and Rebecca Solomon and her brother. Powell was a friend of Rebecca Solomon's brother Simeon. Like Powell and Swinburne, Simeon Solomon was what we might now academically call queer. The term homosexual had not yet been applied to them at the time to criminalize and pathologize their longings. That does not mean Simeon Solomon escaped punishment for his sexuality. As we know from letters by Rebecca Solomon to Powell from our collection now on deposit at the National Library, Powell paid Rebecca Solomon £15 for this painting at a time when the money would have been particularly welcomed. The payments were made in installments, and the sum was paid in full in 1873. Now, a great deal had happened during those intervening months. By the time Powell had made the final installment on the painting, Simeon Solomon had been fined £100 for sexual offences after having, in the parlance of the day, unlawfully attempted feloniously to commit the abominable crime of buggery. Solomon's career went into steep decline, and before he ended up in the workhouse, he depended on the support of his sister and his few remaining friends, George Powell among them. The image of a woman caring for an injured creature proved somehow prophetic. The Wounded Dove takes on new meaning if we bear the relationship of the collector, the artist and the artist's disgraced brother in mind. It also reminds us as an institution not simply to absorb private collections, but to honor the collectors who choose to gift or bequeath objects to a museum. If there is one maker of images represented in our collections who teaches us carefully to read visuals, to look longer and to look closer, it is the painter-printmaker Stanley Anderson. Anderson's etchings are a prime example as well of one of the major strengths of our collections. European prints from the Renaissance to the present day, in particular British fine art prints produced during the etching revival. Now, this engraving was made 2 decades after the collapse of the print market. It demonstrates Anderson's perseverance, his dedication to his work as a printmaker. Anderson loathed the word artist, so I'll avoid calling him that. He preferred what, in a letter to a friend, he called the old assignments: stone carver, painter, engraver, illuminator, cabinet maker, hurdle maker, farrier and smith, etc. For such terms, he argued, are free from snobbery. Giotto, Masaccio, and the others made pictures. Donatello carved figures with art, which per dictionary and common usage used to mean skill. In this enlightened age, Anderson declared, Picasso, Matisse, Braque, and the rest become that rarefied essence, the artist. Ugh. That's Anderson's ugh, not mine. Making the gate reflects on the act of making, on skill and tradition, and on the trade of those who create objects by hand. Anderson's subjects are not types. They are real people whose work Anderson observed as carefully as he carried out his own work. Here, Anderson takes us inside the workshop of Rupert Timms, whose smithy in Thame, Oxfordshire, had been Anderson's subject on 2 previous occasions. During the Second World War, Timms had derived his income chiefly from supplying horseshoes to the military. Adjustment to civilian life proved difficult, as demand for his work dwindled. Anderson encouraged Timms and his father to diversify as ornamental blacksmiths. Working to a design supplied by Anderson, they entered and won the first post-war Royal Show competition for blacksmiths, which was staged in 1947 at Oxford. Anderson displays his winning design at the top right, showing Rupert Timms at work on the gate. An increase in riding and horse shows during the 1950s allowed Timms to return to his original trade, references to which are on display here as well. So it is a success story anticipated by Anderson, who positions a boy from his village at the smithy door. The boy has stopped playing and, perhaps intrigued by the work going on there, looks inside. His curiosity suggests a chance of renewal for the smithy. Anderson took time to capture the traditions that, in an age of mechanization and modernization, he saw disappearing before his eyes. We might look at those prints nostalgically, but for Anderson, the disrespect for the skills that he feared might die with the subjects he commemorated in his prints was as painful as his own approach to printmaking was painstaking. In this case, at least, what he managed to communicate in meticulous detail was a rare story of survival. And if you visit the town of Thames in Oxfordshire, you will be able to see the actual gate, which survives to this day. Prints and their histories are as central to the collections as they are to the teaching of art practice at the School of Art. The fact that the school teaches traditional techniques does not mean that it is stuck in the past. Prints like this one by painter-printmaker Marcel Hansela are among our more recent acquisitions. This etching seems far removed from the precision that is characteristic of Anderson's engravings, but both are politically charged, both respond concretely to their time. Hansela's prints have been exhibited in our museum since 2008, but Hansela has also worked at the school to experiment with techniques and collaborated with the school's printmakers Paul Croft and Andrew Baldwin, who introduced her to lithography as well as processes of etching and sugar aquatint. In her practice, Hansela engages with the tradition of Western art, especially the visual culture of her birthplace, the Netherlands, in order to take on challenging social issues of the present day. White Collar Black Man references this painting by the 17th century Dutch portrait artist Govert Flinck, which shows the back of a black man in uniform wearing a white collar. While a collar serves as an indicator of social status, the personhood of the figure is obscured. We do not get to look into his eyes, and he does not get to gaze back at us. In addition, Hansela appropriates a cartoon figure that is often seen in designs for today's mass-manufactured fashion. She applied color by repeatedly stamping the subject. Referencing the mass-produced while making a unique work of art, Hansela creates a clash between the multiple and the one-of-a-kind that drives home the continued threat to identity through imposed conformity. In this and many of our other prints, Hansela is confronting us with the exploitation and endangerment of children, which is highlighted by the child's exposed neck and shoulders. There are over 40 prints by Marcel Hansela in the School of Art collections. The Mickey Mouse ears are a recurring feature in Hansela's work. In some of her prints, they serve as headgear worn in lieu of a helmet to draw attention to the continued exploitation of children in times of military conflict. The merging or confrontation of high and low culture, of fine art and commerce, commentary and documentary is nowhere more pronounced than in the medium of photography. Works like this one by the Welsh-born artist Angus MacBain are representative of our growing collection of photography, the histories and practices of which are also taught at the school. Our museum was the first in Wales to collect photography as art, at a time in the mid-1970s when the National Museum had not yet established its photography collection, and the National Library of Wales was collecting photography of the people and landscapes of Wales mainly for their documentarian value. Photography in the School of Art, Museum and Galleries collections is represented by outstanding Italian neo-realist works, the most significant of such collections outside Italy, German photography of the Third Reich, and the UK's most representative public collection of vintage prints by MacBain. MacBain is now primarily known as a photographer of celebrities, many of whose likenesses he surrealized. But MacBain was also an interior designer, as this photograph demonstrates. In 1954, MacBain designed the interior of a cinema restaurant on Oxford Street in London. In fact, MacBain had previously designed the cinema itself. And this is a photograph by MacBain showing the finalized design of the restaurant. MacBain was then asked to promote the restaurant and to show it busy and thriving before it had even opened. Long before Photoshop was used to produce composite images and digitally to manipulate them, collages were created using scissors and glue. An easier solution to the problem MacBain created for himself would have been for him to photograph stand-ins for the pavilion's clients in the studio wearing different costumes and adopting a variety of poses. By printing individual photographs of make-believe staff and patrons in a range of sizes, MacBain would have been able to approximate their relative scale from foreground to background. Instead, MacBain took a more complex and time-consuming approach. Having lit and photographed the empty restaurant interior, the camera tripod and lighting remained static, while a stand-in performed costume changes and posed in each of the chairs. Chair by chair, the stand-in was photographed on location. The photograph of the empty restaurant and each of the figures were printed in the same size. The figures were then cut out and pasted onto the empty restaurant background, appearing exactly to scale, convincingly lit, and achieving a greater illusion of spatial recession. This unique collage was then rephotographed so that further copies could be printed from a single glass plate negative. In all, there are 19 cutouts. All of them are photographs of McBain's assistant and lover, David Ball, dressed and cross-dressing in Edwardian costumes. Ball poses as staff and patrons, gentlemen and ladies. The finalized image was shown on the cinema screen with the slogan, "All the best people eat at the Pavilion restaurant." McBain said about this collage that it was the most complicated scissors and paste job he had ever done, and perhaps the one of which he was most proud. What is so clever about this camp performance, and what was no doubt a matter of pride to McBain, apart from its virtuosity, is that it enabled McBain publicly to celebrate his lover, to publicize his love at a time when homosexual acts were still illegal in Britain. In the 1940s, McBain himself had been arrested for homosexual offenses. Making the private public and advertising his queer desires, McBain turned his commercial work into an autobiographical act. Let's move on now to another major aspect of our collections, ceramics. While pottery has featured in our collections since the 19th century, our collections also reflect a revival of interest in studio ceramics in the 1970s, resulting in a growing number of ceramics exhibitions and increased coverage in new publications such as Ceramic Review and Crafts Magazine. Many late 20th century ceramicists produced objects that questioned the established boundaries between art and craft. Key to this development and to our acquisition of new works has been the International Potters Festival, which has been held biannually at Aberystwyth since 1987. One such purchase by the school is this work by the conceptual ceramicist Paul Scott. In his practice and research, Scott engages with traditional techniques, precious materials, and mass-manufactured transferware to explore complex relationships between past and present, nature and culture, as well as art history and current affairs. This fragmented and reassembled willow pattern platter commemorates the 2011 disaster at a nuclear power plant in Fukushima, Japan. Appropriating the great wave of Kanagawa, a widely reproduced 19th century print by Katsushika Hokusai, Scott's collage recreates the moment at which an earthquake-triggered tsunami hit the plant, resulting in one of the greatest human-made disasters since Chernobyl. To achieve this joining of references, Scott employs the centuries-old Japanese technique of kintsugi, meaning golden seams, or kintsukuroi, meaning golden repair, which is used to mend broken ceramics. The challenges of repair and the delicate processes of mending are contrasted with the devastating subject matter. The nuclear power plant at Fukushima is part of the design that Scott imposed on what is too carefully crafted to be called a rectified ready-made. Not all of the three-dimensional works in our collections are as delicate and sensitive. Some are potentially so damaging that they must be handled with the utmost care. But what kind of mending, of making amends is needed may not be immediately apparent to us. This object dates from a period when statuary was still a focus of our collections. Almost all of our statuary was acquired during the university's first 50 years. It was a time of civic and national pride in Wales, which saw the formation of the constituent colleges of the University of Wales, the National Museum, and the National Library of Wales. Those institutions demanded public sculpture, and the growing national consciousness meant there was no shortage of patronage for Welsh artists. Clearly, this object stands out, even though it was the work of the Welsh sculptor Goscombe John, one of Britain's most reputable sculptors of his day. His portraits, statuettes, war memorials, and medals can be seen all over Wales. Who or what is being commemorated here? The subject of this bust was a real person, but does that make this bust a portrait? Bokani was a member of the Mbuti people, a Congolese tribe from the Ituri forest. That much is carved into the back of the bust. Along with 5 other Mbuti, Bokani was brought, persuaded, cajoled, coaxed into coming to the UK in 1905 by James J. Harrison, a retired lieutenant colonel and big game hunter. The ostensible aim of Harrison's expedition to the Congo had been, in Harrison's words, to secure a few of the tiny inhabitants for medical and scientific purposes. Going on display as living specimens, the Mbuti group appeared at the London Hippodrome and were presented at Buckingham Palace. At least once, they were shown in a zoo. For 3 years, they toured Britain, Aberystwyth being one stop of that tour, and continental Europe until their return home. Harrison insisted that his little friends, as he called them, had the time of their life and would long remember the wonders and kindness of the white masters. Bokani was subjected to extensive physical examination, in the process of which this bust was produced. According to one researcher, the bust was modeled at the suggestion of members of the British Museum and the Royal Anthropological Institute. A bronze version was exhibited at the Royal Academy. Displaying this bust now, as we have in 2021, our museum is mindful of its responsibility of dealing with the past, including its own. Not everything in our collections reflects our values today, but the carefully contextualized display of such objects provides us with opportunities to reflect a change in values, to reevaluate the past, and to invite a continued dialogue about our future. The objects in our museum collections can teach us a lot about ourselves. Some of them are reproduced in the 2022 Aberystwyth University publication, Pennies of the People. Co-authored by members of staff, the book marks the 150th anniversary of the university and tells some of its stories in 150 objects. The Powell bequest features in 3 entries. There is Simeon Solomon's Love Dreaming by the Sea, a rock crystal casket owned by Powell, who claimed that it contained a splinter of Robert Schumann's coffin, and a watercolor painting that Powell commissioned as an illustration for a book of Icelandic legends on which he collaborated. The subject of this painting is a personification of Iceland. Key to Icelandic identity formation, this iconic image has appeared in many reproductions, including Icelandic postage stamps. In recent years, it has met with the enthusiasm of Icelandic visitors to Wales, some of whom are now making our school a point of destination. There are many objects that resonate with me as a collector of ephemera and movie memorabilia, such as this unique album of photographs and conceptual drawings for a 1949 Hollywood fantasy film. Our galleries provide opportunities to showcase such outliers and rarities, and to make a public display of our research on them. We annually stage shows exclusively drawn from our collections. In fact, all of the works highlighted in this talk have been exhibited in recent years. And most of those themed shows were staged in collaboration with undergraduate students enrolled on our curating module. New acquisitions call for new exhibitions. With the cooperation of artists or estates and with V&A MLA purchase grants and art fund support, over 2,800 artworks have been purchased or gifted since January 2014 alone. 5 endowment funds now provide for our museum's needs, allowing us to acquire artworks, care for and display them, as well as disseminate information about them through print publication and online resources. We are especially grateful for the generous gifts and bequests, including the hundreds of individual contributions from our friends and former students that benefit our research, enhance our teaching, and that through our public exhibitions enrich the cultural life of our community here in Wales. I hope, as this close-up of our building is meant to suggest, that you have gotten a little closer to the School of Art, Museum and Galleries. There is no substitute for stepping inside to experience works of visual culture and material culture like the ones you have encountered here as reproductions only. And I certainly encourage you to discover your own favorites from our collections. Well, thank you very much, George Powell and Willem Nauer from Wales.